Well, we got to talk about the banking crisis again. The banking crisis is, it's a crisis. Yesterday, we had several executives and Republicans and Democrats freaking out with all their ideas about how to solve the banking crisis. I'm going to give you a quick lowdown on what happened in Congress yesterday. Spoiler alert, nothing. But more interestingly, we're going to see Donald Trump lash out about the banking crisis. That's interesting. And we're going to talk about how Deutsche Bank was potentially manipulated via the credit default swap skyrocketing that we saw last week on Friday, which led to a lot of shivers in the stock market, especially in the banking sector. Now, be warned, if Donald Trump upsets you, see this little banner right here that says paid promotion? It's because I'm about to tell you, you can still get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes by going to vetkevin.com/life, Apple Pay or Android Pay for it. All right, banner gone. All right, let's get started. So first, yesterday, several Republicans freaked out over the FDIC's handling of Silicon Valley Bank in the crisis. Chairman Grünberg asked, why did the FDIC reject bidders that might have taken over the bank before regulators were required to, basically jump in? And the FDIC is basically like, look, there was too little time for people to do due diligence, and we have restrictions on how long it could take for people to go through this due diligence, so we basically rejected some of the initial bids. Keep in mind how the Swiss National Bank ended up resolving the takeover of Credit Suisse. They basically told UBS, look, pay this amount, agree to take this much in losses, you're buying this fixer-upper, we will guarantee the next $15 billion of losses. Just don't look too closely. We know it's a toxic bank. Just please say you'll take it over, and we will just give you more and more money until you say yes. That's how the Swiss pulled it off. But anyway, you had freaking out on both sides over here. Republicans especially were freaking out in terms of why the Fed didn't actually regulate these banks earlier. Even though a lot of problems have been identified at Silicon Valley Bank, it's true. It's like, where was the supervising? Yeah, there were inquiries and there were letters and there were complaints about Silicon Valley Bank in the past, but nobody actually dropped the hammer. So they're kind of right about that. But then, of course, you had both sides split on whether or not we should have more regulation. You had Elizabeth, and I'm summarizing like a 3 or 4 hour event yesterday, okay? And we're going to do this fast. Elizabeth Warren yesterday is like, all right, look, we need a whole lot more regulation. And then Republicans are like, but is that fair to the banks that weren't reckless? And so that kind of gives you a little bit of an example of what you could expect to happen over the next 2 years in terms of new banking regulation. Absolutely nothing. Thank you, Congress. Yes, of course, on one side, more regulation, and on the other side, we're just not convinced. Anyway, and then of course there was talk about the FDIC having to take in billions of dollars in potential losses. Ultimately, the FDIC is going to likely pass that on to all the various different member banks of the FDIC, which means your banking fees will probably go up. That is called corporate socialism, but it is what the FDIC is designed for, after all. So it's not a terrible surprise. That's the point. It's kind of like an HOA. Everybody pays in, and then if something falls apart or something gets screwed up, well, then what happens? Well, then you end up having HOA dues potentially go up because, let's say, the pool fell into a sinkhole, and now your HOA dues have to go up because there was some kind of problem that happened. Anyway, so that gives you really a summary of yesterday's banking crisis discussion. It really wasn't worth watching. I hope you didn't watch the whole thing, because what do you think Congress is going to do? Nothing. Instead, let's now listen to Donald Trump, though. Donnie T. Let's see what he thinks should happen. So here's an interview with Donnie T. And let's take a listen in over to this.
I can't even say strongly enough, is in complete shambles. We have 60% of our country now living paycheck to paycheck. CBS News now says 25% of people in our great country are what they call food insecure. Food that can't get bare necessities. Recession record, inflation record, our debt, our deficits. Why is this happen? How would you fix it? And would you have supported the bailout of Silicon Valley Bank?
Okay. Ready?
Yeah.
A lot of questions you're asking me.
I am.
I wouldn't have supported the bailout. The bank would have to get along by itself, and maybe they could have. What happened with the bank is interest rates went too high. And I had my own situation with Powell, and I beat the hell out of him. I was not a big fan of Powell. He was recommended by some people. I didn't like him. He's too interest rate happy.
The argument about reducing oil prices is actually pretty brilliant, because rather than maybe fighting inflation by solely raising interest rates, we could actually, if we had more supply of fossil fuels, yes, those are not the most green right now, but we need fossil fuels to get to a green transition. And if we had a greater supply and more energy independence, we didn't rely on OPEC or OPEC Plus or in the past Russia. We had our own sufficient natural gas and oil reserves to where we could then help out Europe. Maybe we could actually help reduce inflation, because remember, even though we measure inflation in two ways, headline, which includes oil and energy and food prices, and core, which strips out oil, food, and other energy, you still have oil and energy as components of other items within core, whether those are services like Uber drivers who have to charge us more because the cost of gas is higher, or less people are driving Ubers because the cost of gas is so high. Therefore, you have less supply of drivers, and therefore you have higher pricing, because that's how the algos work on Uber. Less supply of drivers, price goes up, right? It's very simple. So oil prices do absolutely trickle through the economy, and I think Donald Trump raises a good argument that maybe we would have had less inflation had we had more energy independence going into this crisis. It is a fair point.
Those treasuries got crushed because Powell keeps raising interest rates. But that's up to Biden. He's going to have to worry about that himself. In theory.
How would you fix it?
Well, I would have done a big number on Powell like I did. I did a very big number. In fact, he wasn't budging.
You wouldn't have given up energy.
He eventually cut him so much that it almost caused a problem. People said, how come he's cut him? He cut him almost a point immediately, because he thought I was going to fire him, okay? Which some people said I had the right to do. Other people said you don't. When you put them there, rightfully, they have to have some protection, et cetera, from a president.
But how much of this is...
But I thought he was hurting the economy.
You left this country for the first time in 75 years. We were energy independent.
Right.
A net exporter of energy.
Right.
Okay.
We were going to be dominant.
Okay. And Europe right now could have used American energy. This winter they could have used it.
Right?
So, but now Joe has cut back dramatically on domestic production of energy. Now we're importing.
Not believable.
We're importing from Venezuela.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia last year, their big oil company, made the most money they've ever made in history.
That's right.
I think it was over $167 billion. How much of that? Because doesn't energy impact trucking? It impacts the price of goods in every store that we go to?
So when Biden came in, the first thing he did was end the Keystone pipeline that I got approved. Okay, it was all approved.
Well, no, he also gave Putin a waiver on the Nord Stream 2.
Okay, so Putin said, because everyone said, oh, I'm so nice to Putin. Putin said, if you're my friend, I'd hate to see you as an enemy. He told me that. I got along very well with Putin. By the way, I'd be able to work that out. It would have never happened in a million years, and even the Democrats admit that. But if this thing isn't solved by the time we have the election, which is possible, it won't be, and there's also possible we'll be in World War III with these idiots that are doing what they're doing. You could end up in a nuclear world war, which will make World War I and World War II look like patty cakes, okay? This unbelievable, because we have people that don't know what they're doing. But if it's not solved, I will have it solved in 24 hours with Zelensky and with Putin. And there's a very easy negotiation to take place, but I don't want to tell you what it is, because then I can't use that negotiation. It'll never work. But there's a very easy negotiation to take place. I will have it solved within one day, a peace between them. Now, that's a year and a half. That's a long time. I can't imagine something not happening. The key with that is the war has to stop now, because Ukraine is being obliterated. Whether
there'll be nothing left.
Well, I looked at pictures of cities that are literally it's like complete demolition. I was in the construction business. You would demolish a building, and it looked like hundreds of these demolition sites. There wasn't a building standing, and these are cities for Ukraine. They were big cities, very big cities. Now, he hasn't really, in Kiev, he hasn't really set the missiles in, but at some point he'll do that one too. There's nothing standing. The other thing is many more people are dead and horribly injured than they're reporting. When you see missiles hitting 15 buildings and 15 buildings falling to the ground, and they're big buildings, there are a lot of people in those buildings, and then they say one person was injured. These are phony reports. Many, many people are being killed that you don't know, but you'll see that later on.
So you'd prefer, if you were president, you think you would have a negotiated settlement and
Within 24 hours.
and we wouldn't no longer be ponying up all the money that, by the way, Western Europe is not doing their fair share.
What's unfair, and you and I have had this conversation, is that we're up to almost $150 billion, and Europe's at $24 billion. Now, it's the same thing with NATO. Don't forget, I got them to put up hundreds of billions of dollars. My first meeting at NATO, I was just there, never did this before. I'm sitting with all these presidents and prime ministers, nice guys, 28 countries, and I'm looking at the charts. I say, could I see who's delinquent because they're supposed to pay? And they say, what do you mean by delinquent? They said, that's a real estate term. When you don't pay your rent, you're delinquent. Could I please see who has not paid? And of the 28 countries, 20 were not paid. They weren't paying. Mm-hmm. And I said, you have to pay. And if you don't pay, I'm not going to protect you. And the head of a very important country stood up and said, who was delinquent, said, could I ask you, if we don't, what you're saying, if Russia attacks us and we aren't paid up, you're not going to protect us? I said, that's exactly what I mean.
All right. So that gives you a little bit on Donnie T here. Now, I want to give you some reactions to this because, first of all, I have to say, there's something that Donald Trump does, whether you like him or not, that, as Ben Malla said in my interview with him just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump has a way of inspiring hope in people that somebody like, unfortunately, in the opinion of Ben Malla, Ron DeSantis may not. Now, here's the way you have to look at what just happened here. Is it realistic that Donald Trump could negotiate peace between Russia and Zelensky within 24 hours? Unlikely. But did it inspire hope? Well, if you hate Donald Trump, it probably inspired you vomiting. But that's okay. You could get life insurance in as little as 5 minutes and help solve that problem. But if you don't hate him, and at least you're somewhat neutral, relatively, maybe, somewhat still in the middle, at least there's this like, it kind of makes you think like, is it possible? Like if Joe Biden, well, maybe not Joe Biden, but let's put it this way. If Obama, okay, if Obama right now had a corridor, like 100% safe corridor, where in one room there was Putin, and in the other room there was Zelensky, and Obama's like, all right, I'm just going to keep going back and forth until I got this solved. We're going to solve this problem, all right, everyone? Thank you very much. This is bad. But anyway, the point is, maybe it would get done. Now, I want to be very clear here. What Donald Trump is using is hyperbole. He is not actually saying with certainty he could end the war in Ukraine and Russia in 24 hours. Now, even though he's saying that, he's not saying it absolutely, and he's not saying it in a way where people should actually believe it. But what it's doing is it's inspiring the urgency. It's sending the signal that I, Donald Trump, will make this a top priority. And if I don't get it done in a day, then fine. Maybe I'll get it done in 2 days or a week. But it's certainly not going to be years. That's what he's inspiring. And he's doing that by using hyperbole. That is, he's exaggerating. I'll get it done in 24 hours. And he's highlighting the difference between him and other contenders, like Ron DeSantis, who initially said this was just sort of a territorial dispute, or Joe Biden, who's kind of quiet on it, other than let's send more money to Zelensky, right? Which is becoming somewhat of a politically divided issue. So it's something to pay attention to. This isn't to say that Donald Trump is the candidate. It's not to say that he could just go on TV and lie about how he's going to do all this stuff and then not do it. Like, in fairness, where's his healthcare plan? It never happened when he was in office, right? Kayleigh McEnany famously held up all these 400 pages that had no substance. There was no healthcare plan. So you also have to balance this with a lot of stuff he just says to get elected, in fairness. But from a voter's point of view, it creates inspiration. It aggravates frustration with the status quo, and it makes people want change. So what Donald Trump does is he actually inspires that hope. He instills hope that, well, maybe there would be a way to save people's lives and the cities and the buildings that are destroyed. Maybe there is a way to avoid World War III because nobody wants that. We don't want, World War I and II to look like patty cakes. That sounds terrible. You get introduced to hope that you didn't even realize could exist. And that motivates people to vote for Donald Trump. Think about this. He says, quote, I would have done a big number on Powell. I've done it before. I had him under the threat of firing him. He was so scared he ended up cutting rates. Now, what's interesting is we don't know if Powell ended up cutting rates in 2018 because the market and bond market were freaking out or because of Donald Trump's threats. But Donald Trump was threatening to fire him in the second half of 2018. I remember covering it here on YouTube. I remember it very clearly. Everybody's like, you can't fire him. He's like, I'm going to fire him. And technically, there's supposed to be a division between the Federal Reserve and politics. Technically, the Federal Reserve is supposed to be apolitical. It gets appointed and authorized to do its job by Congress, but it's technically not a part of the government. It's supposed to be independent. This is despite the fact that the Financial Times just yesterday was reporting that Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen are basically trying to align their messaging on banks, which is a problem because Janet Yellen is basically a puppet of the Biden administration, which is a political office. And if Jerome Powell's trying to align with Yellen, then you have political alignment. So it's a very, very blurry line. But what else did Donald Trump say? Well, he said, we shouldn't focus on rates. We should just focus on lowering the cost of oil. How about we drill more? How about instead of banning the Keystone Pipeline, we just have more energy independence? So he makes some really good points. And I hate to say it, but if you took Donald Trump right here out of context and you ignored all of the past, all his faux pas, Jan 6, all the investigations, the Stormy Daniels, if you just ignored all of the past and you took that clip and put it next to a clip from Biden and a clip from DeSantis right now, Donald Trump would win. That it was very inspiring. So, you know, I'm not a Trump apologist, okay, by any means. Like, I do my best to be very in the middle. But I actually think the way he presents this information, he brings up ideas that really we're not talking about as much as we should. You know, the idea of more energy independence, the idea of how maybe more energy independence can help us reduce inflation. It's logical, but it's not one that gets talked about a lot. The idea of why don't we have a world leader actually trying to negotiate peace, and the United States is in the best place to do it, whereas we're not even remotely trying to negotiate with them. Are we handcuffed to the military-industrial complex, which is telling us, no, don't negotiate peace. We like the orders. I don't know. It's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. So I think that's a good little analysis there on the Trump part. Now I quickly want to talk about what happened with those credit default swaps regarding the banking crisis. I do think Trump, by the way, saying that Silicon Valley Bank should just fail, I don't think it would have been as bad as people think, because basically the bank would have gotten bought out at a discount. It would have gotten liquidated, and then depositors would have taken like a 10 to 20% haircut. It might have created more fear and contagion, and that's just the unknown. But it's like not like people over the FDIC limit would have lost all their money. It would have been a percentage, 10, 20%, maybe as much as 30%, but not more. We'll never know. Anyway, on Friday, we did see credit default swaps for Charles Schwab skyrocket. However, it's worth noting that fewer than 20% of Charles Schwab's depositors actually exceed the $250K FDIC limit. 90% of depositors at Silicon Valley Bank exceeded the $250K limit. That's why there was so much political drama about protecting depositors here. Charles Schwab has 34 million accounts, 7 trillion assets. It's literally huge. Yeah, they've got $29 billion in unrealized losses, but with bonds rallying, that actually has been falling. They suggest they have enough liquidity to cover deposits right now. Of course, they're considering also other assets that they would have to liquidate. You don't have enough cash to cover deposits ever at a bank. But Schwab seems pretty strong. That's Charles Schwab. We were supposed to talk about Deutsche Bank, but let me get this out of the way. Some people have been asking me about it. 51% of their income comes from net interest revenue. Their sweep account pays just 0.45%. But the bank seems pretty strong right now. So people bringing up questions about Schwab, probably unnecessary to worry about Schwab at this point. TBD, though, we can keep an eye on it. Regarding Deutsche Bank, same story. Their revenue's increasing. Their profits are increasing. Schwab's actually doing fantastic. Deutsche Bank's actually doing pretty dang well over the last few years if you look at their financials. Deutsche Bank had credit default swaps skyrocket on Friday. Apparently, the reason for that was a single trade. One trader, we don't know who it is, but one person put on a $5 million bet. And because these are so illiquid, they led credit default swaps to skyrocket on Friday, sending a signal to markets that was actually inappropriate. One trader made a bet, freaked out the market that Deutsche Bank credit default swaps were skyrocketing, which is an insurance against failure. And all of a sudden, the entire market gets, its panties in a knot, thinking, oh my God, the banking crisis is worsening. Clickbait. It was one freaking trader. So it's kind of interesting to look at that. So long and short of all of this, Trump, we talked about, long and short of the banking crisis. So far, does there really seem to be widespread systemic risk outside of the risky banks? No. Is this issue potentially going to fade away? Yes. Could there be other issues? Yes. Do we see those red flags now? No. So when it comes to the banking crisis, get life insurance and keep putting one foot in front of the other. In as little as 5 minutes, you could go to metkevin.com/life and get yourself paid promotion life insurance. Paid promotion life insurance here. Little as 5 minutes, Apple or Android pay for it. Get free stocks by going to metkevin.com/Weeble. 12 free stocks. And use buy now, pay later on the programs on building your wealth. Linked down below. That concludes the banking crisis and Donald Trump lash out section.